Did it go live? I don't believe it.
Yes, we are live.
I don't believe it.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 31 of the TechForge podcast.
No way we've done 31.
We're over that 30 hump.
No.
Yes, we are over the big 30. We are to number 31.
My gosh.
We're 31 episodes old.
We have nothing better to do on Thursday nights.
Ain't that the truth?
No, because
anyway, I am your host, as always, Dynamo Ned, aka Ned, and I am joined by my ever faithful co-hosts, Jason and Hunter.
What?
Hey.
All right. Well, got an interesting show this week, some things to talk about, but before we get into the tech news this week, I wanted to briefly hand the floor over to Jason to talk about something that's popped up in the tech YouTube community in just the last few days, and it's something that's important to us that we wanted to specifically address before we got into the tech news this week. So, Jason, the floor is yours.
So this has really been bothering me, right? Like back in September, The Verge, we all know The Verge came out with this horribly bad how to build your own PC video, and they got crucified, raked over the coals. Everyone from, the small YouTubers in the shack, like making videos to some of the bigger media outlets, like they were talking about it and ripping it to pieces like they should. And to kind of comment on that, something is bad when they've completely closed off likes and dislikes and commentary, or feedback from the community on a video. When you see that, it's either something kind of fishy or maybe a scam or something else. So, and they had a million opportunities to turn it around, like most other self-respecting tech tubers do when they make a mistake. They'll often come out and say, hey, we messed up. My bad. Here's what we should have done. That's usually what they do. And people respond with likes. You'll have your crazies that come out and say silly stuff, but they didn't do that. They acted completely unprofessionally about it. And, and there's a bunch of drama for a while. And they eventually took the video down. Now, the article is still up on The Verge, but pretty much everyone forgot about it. And all of a sudden, they come out and do a copyright strike, which I don't know that much about the process, but what I essentially know is that if you get 3 of them in a certain amount of time, I think it's an automated process, and your channel can go down. And in a lot of cases, just getting 1 strike removes you from live streaming, and it removes a lot of features of YouTube that can heavily impact making a livelihood at it. And one of my favorite parodies of the Verge video was done by Bitwit's Kyle. He came out with his alter ego Lyle, and it was a very funny video. But when you're releasing content out on the web, you're open to feedback. You're open to criticism. And again, The Verge did not handle it properly at all. If anything, they showed exactly who they are. And now they're going out and, well, at least recently, they're putting copyright strikes on tech tubers that try and make a living on YouTube. I don't know what percentages of their overall income or livelihood comes with this stuff, but it's completely ridiculous. And I think Gamers Nexus said or had made some sort of a mention of how everyone that's doing parodies of this stuff, it's all under fair use, which is completely backed by the law. And I don't know. Honestly, I'm disgusted by the whole thing. And I know that a lot of other people out there in this community feels exactly the same way. And the way The Verge has handled this, Vox Media or whatever, I honestly don't know how they can take themselves seriously as tech journalists. You don't see Tom's Hardware doing this stuff. You don't see non-tech doing this kind of stuff, right? Hard OCP, any of OC3D, AMD Zone, back in the day, like, or Socket.com, like, you don't see any of those originators or journalists doing this kind of stuff. It's completely unprofessional and it's ridiculous. I hope that something comes back on The Verge that will hurt them enough to cause them to not do this to other people in the future, because this really, really negatively impacts those that are trying to make an honest living at this stuff, and that put content out there for us to learn and to appreciate, because that's this new media outlet, YouTube and some other things. This is how a lot of us learn. A lot of us don't have thousands of dollars to just buy lots of stuff and break things until we learn. We have to go to others to learn. Like if you want to know about water cooling, you look up the wealth of encyclopedia type knowledge that Jay's 2 Cents has, because he's been through that stuff. Like, that's what he loves to do. If you want to look at some really decent budget builds, you go to Paul or Kyle. Like, they have lots of really great content around that stuff. And when you've got a huge media outlet like Vox Media that's doing this stuff, it's really hurting the industry, because they've got the capacity to do it.
Yeah, to me, it really strikes me as the clash that exists between alternative media on the internet and the old media standbys. Now, there was a time when Vox Media, along with Gawker and a bunch of others in the early to mid 2000s, they were the new media. That's back when blogs and whatnot they were the dominant thing going before YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And now that YouTube has come along and matured to the point where people are able to make their livelihoods off of it, it's taken away from their ability, Vox Media and the like, to monetize their blogs as they did traditionally. And so I just see this as a part of Vox Media aligning themselves with the older styles of media and using their consolidated corporate power to affect what are essentially small businesses.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what kind of makes this confusing, because yes, they are traditional media, but they've got a very vibrant YouTube presence. They've got 2.4 million subscribers on the Verge channel. 2.4 million. And they've got some decent content on there. I've checked some of their stuff out. It's pretty legit. It's got good production quality and stuff like that, which just makes me wonder why they behave in such a way.
I kind of think that it might have been like the original video was done by a person who doesn't really. He claimed that he built computers before, but it doesn't really show it.
No.
But one thing I wanted to bring up is the pain that it causes the YouTubers is if you get 3 strikes in, I think it's in a month is what I heard, then you get your live streaming ability gets restricted for 90 days, which that hurt Kyle, because Kyle and Paul of Paul's Hardware, Kyle of Bitwit, did live streams for Awesome Hardware. Their combined name, Kyle's previous name, Awesome Sauce
News.
Yeah. So they kept doing that, and Paul was saying today in the video I saw today that that would hurt their live streaming ability because he wouldn't be able to do it for 90 days. And they do that weekly. And it would definitely hurt Kyle's, probably would hurt Kyle's numbers because that's viewership that's not getting there. And with live streaming, that also allows people to donate money to get their questions seen better. So it hurts them getting revenue from that. And yeah, it would probably eventually hit numbers. People would either stop watching for a time, not knowing that he would be back or not, if they didn't read his Twitter feed.
You know, Kyle from Bitwit strikes me as a very, very good character person. And I don't think I would be surprised if he were to actually sue Vox Media, but he's well within his rights to do so. I hope something happens to where maybe not damages, but I hope that there's some sort of a reaction, appropriate reaction to The Verge and to Vox Media for all of these silly shenanigans. Silly is not really the word I want to use, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Something needs to happen to them, or something needs to happen to help to prevent this from happening in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we here at CrossForge Gaming and CrossForge Media, we believe in forgiveness and grace. But when you have a repeated behavior, like we see here with The Verge, if it had been a single copyright strike against a single YouTuber, that might have been a mistake, fine. But when seems to be coordinated, because it wasn't just Kyle from Bitwit, it was also Rich from ViewTech USA, and those are the two that and Tech Yes City and a couple of other. Yeah, and so that's at minimum 4 different tech YouTubers who were hit simultaneously over the last couple of days.
Yep.
And
pretty much every tech YouTuber who does reviews hardware and builds computers talked about it.
Right. And so when you do that, the fact that right now on YouTube, you can do something like this and there's basically no repercussions for doing so is a problem.
Yeah. Or there's no means of, or no process in place to prevent false accusations.
And that means that people can trample over YouTubers again and again and again. Verge or whoever else.
I mean, consider us. You know, as of this recording, CrossForge Gaming is a YouTube channel with 703 subscribers. If something we did was to be copyright striked, we wouldn't have the kind of clout or power that someone like Kyle or even Rich or any of those YouTubers have to try and get those copyright strikes resolved or removed. We would be at the mercy of YouTube. And honestly, they are as well, even as big a channels as they are. You know, YouTube, what they tell creators on how to resolve a strike, there are 3 ways to resolve a copyright strike. You can either wait the 90 days for it to expire and go through their silly little copyright school.
It sounds like a speed limit school or whatever, like driver's school.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
You can attempt to contact the person who claimed the video directly and ask them to retract it, which in this case we know that wouldn't have happened. Or you can do what Kyle and all the others did, which is submit a counterclaim notification, where if you believe your video was mistakenly removed because it was misidentified as infringing, or qualifies as a potential for fair use, submit a counter notification. And thankfully, YouTube manually reviewed the videos and say, yeah, this is absolutely fair use, and they removed the strike from the channel.
I'm really glad that YouTube did, I'm really glad YouTube did the right thing.
Yeah.
You know, that does speak pretty well in my mind for them.
And so, anyway, none of that has to do anything with PC hardware, but having seen this happen in the PC tech community, we thought it important to address it here at the top of the show.
So support your favorite tech tubers. Make sure you've got their backs, and make sure you let them know how much you appreciate their content and what they do.
Since that can happen to any tech tuber or any YouTuber, period.
Right.
And I know with CrossForge Gaming, we're gearing up here to start generating even more content. You know, we've basically been doing just TechForge of late, but we're gearing up to do more podcasts, more gaming-related videos, and what have you. And so it concerns me to see that this is still happening in 2019.
It'll still happen. Jay's 2 cents had an example of a YouTube channel that was brought down overnight, and it took a while for the person to, I don't remember the name that he had claimed.
I remember.
But I guess it took a while for that person to clear everything up. Just imagine if that's your only source of income. You know,
exactly.
Yeah. A lot of YouTubers, this is Patreon, especially, is their only form of revenue. Like YouTube is a lot of YouTubers' only job, which is crazy.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that depend on YouTube for their livelihoods, and well, Patreon's a whole. We could do an entire show on Patreon, but and
well, those kind of revenue stream services, I would say, because there's not just Patreon out there.
Right. Well, I was referring to the fact that the issues Patreon has been experiencing of late that indicate that the company may not be as stable as they want everyone to believe. But that's a different topic for another time.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole lot of hours to go through.
Can't say I'm surprised.
But with all that said, let's jump into the tech news for this week. And so we'll start with the miscellaneous stories. The first one is one that is interesting to me, as I am an owner of a Raspberry Pi 3, and that I've used for several different uses. But now, according to WindowsLatest.com, you can now install a full copy of Windows 10 ARM Edition on your Raspberry Pi 3. Now, previously, you had been able to install a specialized version of Windows called Windows 10 IoT Core on the Raspberry Pi, but it was very limited in that it was mostly a platform for developers to develop Internet of Things devices. This Windows 10 ARM is what basically is a full-fledged Windows installation designed to run on the little $35 Raspberry Pi 3.
This is what I've been waiting for. Like, I have a Raspberry Pi 3. I've been waiting to have Windows 10. I was waiting for Windows 10 IoT, and then they just kept dragging it out, I guess, developing it, and just went stale, and I was like, oh, well, whatever.
Well, this particular project is based off the same the same version of Windows 10 on ARM that was originally used on the Nokia Lumia 950 and 950X.
Now that is a tongue twister.
And so basically this was done by a group of third-party developers over on GitHub, where you can download what they call the WOA installer, the Windows on ARM installer, that lets you install this version of Windows 10 onto a Raspberry Pi 3.
I honestly have to say this is a very intriguing device. I was mainly looking at Raspberry Pis, and I'm still kind of looking at them for like an emulation machine, like a little
Right.
Yeah, oh yeah, people have built that.
Mhm.
A little tiny cabinet style. Somebody built somebody with, I forgot the name of the person, with a 3D printer built a controller, like a little Game Boy, not Game Boy, um, Sega, the Sega handheld
Game
style.
Gear or
Yeah, Game Gear. Yeah, like Game
Nomad.
Gear. Yeah,
okay.
like one of those, basically like the Switch is now.
Mhm.
The previous iterations of it a long time ago by other names. The screen in the middle and the controllers. Somebody built a little laptop. There's a lot of gaming, and there are retro games for it.
Yeah.
I've seen
Now,
that.
there's actually been a project I've been working on with my Raspberry Pi 3 where I used if you remember the old Motorola Atrix or the Motorola Droid Bionic, they had what I call a lap dock. Basically, it was a laptop keyboard and like a 10 to 11 inch laptop screen that was just a battery, a keyboard, and a screen. And then you hooked up the phone to it to turn it into a full-fledged laptop.
Nice.
Well, I was able to get one of the lap docks and a couple of adapter cables to where you could plug in a Raspberry Pi 3 in there instead and get a far better experience. And now that you can get this Windows 10 for ARM for a Raspberry Pi 3, you could technically have a Raspberry Pi laptop running Windows 10.
It's pretty sweet, man. That's pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, these Motorola Droid Bionic and Atrix lap docks, you can find them dirt cheap on eBay. I got mine with all the adapter cables for $65.
It's not bad.
So $65 for the lap dock and all the adapter cables, $35 for the Raspberry Pi, and maybe a little bit more for a case. Say 10 to 15 bucks for a 32 gig or a 64 gig SD card.
Mm-hmm.
And you have yourself a nice little laptop-sized internet browsing device.
You've got to really applaud the Raspberry Pi just as a platform. It's so flexible. There's so many applications for it. Anything from mini consoles to mini PCs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Media servers, firewalls, even it's such an amazing little device. Honestly, I was just looking at potentially making a mini console for my car. Getting a battery and a little LCD screen and a bunch of stuff. And it's very inexpensive.
My favorite usage for a Raspberry Pi that I've seen is what's called the Pi hole. It's basically, it is a small DNS and HTTP server that you run between your modem and your network to act as a hardware ad blocker, basically. So you don't have to run stuff like AdBlock or uBlock Origin. Instead, you have a full-on HTTP server that you can control and that comes with an internet blacklist of ad sites so that you can decide which sites you want to receive ads on and which ones you don't.
Huh. Yeah, I'm sure you're laughing at the name.
Yeah, the name.
I laughed at that for like a day when I heard about it. It's hilarious.
Oh, I wanted to make a comment about the food that I had for lunch yesterday. Pile.
Well, it kind of makes.
I had Indian food yesterday. Boy, I got cleaned out,
Oh.
man. Woo!
It does make sense because it's like the ad sites are going into a hole.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened. I ate the Indian food and it went down. Yeah, it went down.
This is the quality content you come here to see, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get too far off the rails, let's move to the next topic. Now, this is an interesting one to me. Now, if you're an old school hardware enthusiast for PCs, the Soyo name, it might be a familiar one. Because way back when, in the, probably the Socket A days.
Wow. That's the before time, dude.
Yeah. Soyo motherboards used to be almost universally known for being high quality but budget motherboards. They weren't quite on the same level as your DFIs or
8-bit.
Yeah, some of the early 8-bit stuff.
Oh, I miss 8-bit so much.
But the Soyo boards were solid budget options. And unfortunately, Soyo largely disappeared from the US market right around the time of the Core 2 era.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. When Core 2 Duo hit the scene, like, yeah. Yep.
But they haven't been completely gone. In fact, they've grown significantly in the Asian market.
Well, they've also been busy in like the workstation and a lot of that professional OEM market too, I believe.
Right. And so this was interesting to me when it came across from Tom's Hardware about the Soyo H310C motherboard. Now, I actually saw a couple of videos on this on YouTube a while back, but apparently this has now come out officially. The Soyo H310CM-V3H V2.0 motherboard is an Intel motherboard specifically designed with the H310 chipset, or the H310C chipset. Now, typically, that's something that would support 8th and 9th generation Intel processors, except Soyo specifically markets this motherboard as also supporting 6th and 7th generation Intel CPUs, ones that would normally be on the 100 and 200 series chipsets.
Interesting.
Now, we did a segment a while back about the H310C chipset, in that the H310C is manufactured on Intel's older 22-nanometer process, and unlike its its higher-level counterparts, it does support Windows 7. You might remember that some of the newer Intel and AMD chipsets don't officially support Windows 7, but instead support Windows 10. Now, Windows 7 will still run on those chipsets, but starting with Kaby Lake and going forward, you'd get a message saying, hey, your operating system isn't officially supported on this motherboard.
Right.
But that's not the case on the H310C. And so Soyo, when they released this motherboard, have set it up to where it can handle everything from the 6000 series Skylake CPUs all the way up to the 9th gen Coffee Lake refresh CPUs, which is impressive to me because we almost never see a product that covers that many generations of Intel CPUs.
Now, I was just checking AMD.com, and for the X470 driver, you can get Windows 7 support. So Sorry, I didn't mean to throw that in.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I wanted to show some pictures here, so I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
So let's pop over to present to everyone. So this is the motherboard in question, the Soyo H310C. Notice it's pretty bare bones.
Mm-hmm.
Only 2 DIMM slots. Here, let me expand the photo.
It's a pretty small micro ATX, right?
It's micro ATX. Notice on the back end, PS2 ports of all things, a VGA port, HDMI, 2 USB 3.0s, 4 more USB 2.0s, and a gigabit LAN socket, RJ45, and simple 2.1 channel sound.
Look, MSI, you can actually support video out.
Ooh, did you say that out loud?
Yeah, my see, that was my inside words coming on the outside again.
I see. So yeah, here we get a better view of the I/O. And so that's a quick look at the board itself.
I mean, for a budget board, it looks perfectly fine. You know?
But just think about if you were looking for a while back, I got a deal on an H170 motherboard that I had to purchase a Skylake Celeron G3900 to flash the BIOS just so I could drop a Kaby Lake chip into.
Interesting.
This would handle not only that Celeron G3900 and the Kaby Lake chip that I put in that other motherboard, it would also handle, in theory, an 8700K and a 9900K.
Dude, that thing's got 3-phase VRM.
I mean,
I wouldn't put a 6-core i5 on that thing.
Admittedly.
Yeah. BIOS support.
It technically supports it in the idea that you could run it at stock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In theory. In theory.
It has BIOS support.
Yes. The BIOS supports that, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, and 9,000 series CPUs from Intel. Which it is, in and of itself, is pretty impressive to me. Mm-hmm. It's the little board that could. And so, Soyo, good on you for finding a way to hack in 6th and 7th generation processor support. I would almost be tempted to try and get one just to see if, I could take my 7700, drop it in there, and see what happens.
Yeah. Put a fan on the VRM.
Yep. Anyway, so
quad core would be safe. I think a quad core would be all right. Anything more?
Throw a Core i3 8100 on there and call it a day.
Right.
Or if I'm feeling particularly adventurous, maybe the new 9100F.
It's the final meltdown? Is that what we're seeing?
Maybe. And speaking of hardware, this next one comes from PC Gamer about the Steam hardware survey. So we know every month Steam collects data about the hardware its users are using to game on. And so apparently, according to the Steam hardware survey from January 2019, there were already people using the Radeon 7. Of course, those were probably people doing testing and getting stuff ready for the launch on February the 7th.
From when?
From January 29th. They say 2019 on here, but
so last month.
So last month's hardware survey.
Interesting.
And so, according to the Steam hardware survey, approximately 74% of all gaming PCs use Nvidia graphics cards. Roughly 15.3% use AMD, and 10.5% use Intel integrated graphics chips.
Not surprising.
The most popular GPU by far is the GTX 1060, accounting for roughly 15% of all reported graphics cards.
Can't knock people for running that. That's still a great GPU for the price.
Yeah, the GTX 1060, especially the 6 gig version, is still a solid 1080p card. Has been for the last 2.5 years. Probably will be for at least another year and a half.
Yeah.
Yep.
The 1050 Ti came in second at 9.3%. And basically all the top 11 graphics cards were all GTX cards, which tells us something about RTX cells.
Yep.
Basically, the RTX 2070, which is the most popular RTX card, by the way, at least so far, increased usage from by 0.16% to a total percentage of reported systems of 0.33%.
Well, until the 2060 came out, that was the most affordable RTX. So that's understandable. I mean, it and the 2060 are probably going to be the top sellers for the RTX line, I think. So,
an interesting point of fact, AMD's Radeon RX Vega, they don't break it out into 56 and 64, but Radeon RX Vega actually has higher reported usage than the RTX 2080 Ti.
Really?
At 0.16%. The 2080 Ti came in just under that at 0.15%.
Well, part of the reason for that is when you go to install the Vega, it just says AMD RX Vega. Like, it doesn't differentiate between 56 and 64. Owners know what they have, but that's about it.
That would also make sense with the price of between the two.
And with Radeon 7 starting to move out there, I don't know how it identifies. I assume it probably uses a different identifier. But
I'm not sure, actually, because one of the bigger differences, at least from a software perspective, and the reason why there was the bad driver issue is because one of the things they did to change the 7-nanometer part versus the 56 and 64 is they completely changed all the back-end API calls. So that's pretty much the primary reason why the driver was having issues. All the API calls were different on the Radeon 7 versus Vega 56 and 64. Sorry.
And so, of course, you can always go to Steam's website to take a look at the Steam hardware data survey.
Yeah, interesting.
We'll have a link to that down below to include in the set of article links, so you can check that out. But there is some very interesting data there. And so if you are part of that 0.16% of users using Vega, well, you might consider yourself lucky if you're an AMD fan, because unfortunately, there are some pretty persistent rumors that Radeon's Navi 7-nanometer GPUs have been delayed until October.
That was such a bummer when I read those headlines and saw those videos online. There's been delay after delay with this thing. It was supposed to come out last year. And now we're looking at October of 2019.
Yeah,
their window of opportunity is diminishing because Nvidia is going to move to a 7 nanometer eventually here. So,
and you know, people have been talking about how the Radeon 7 is underwhelming or disappointing, but we have to remember Vega was never designed with 7 nanometer in mind. It was designed around a 14 nanometer architecture.
mm-hmm.
And based on what we do know about its design process, it never got as fully baked as Raja Kaduri wanted it to be.
Yeah, and there's been press that's come out, you know, right around when he departed AMD to Intel. There was some press around how there was a big internal directive to go with moving most of the engineering over to supporting consoles. But some of the other press that's come to light about that is Microsoft and Sony have helped tremendously with the R&D budgets of Navi. You know, it's been a partnership. So that's a large reason why they catered so much to their clients like that. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad move, honestly.
No, and it's not terribly surprising, given that Lisa Su's background was in the semi-custom fabrication business.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was part of her initiatives when she became CEO that really pushed AMD more toward the semi-custom direction that has made them as profitable as it has.
And let's face it, I mean, say what you will about the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, those were extremely creative approaches to getting $300 to $500 consoles out there. That's a lot of graphics horsepower that's in those, and just purely from a design perspective, those are very interesting and creative designs.
Yeah,
Jaguar cores and DDR5, like shared memory pools and all that stuff. The GPU alone.
Yeah, you have to remember the Xbox One has graphics processing power roughly on par with the RX 480, and the Xbox One S is more on par with the RX 590, at least from a graphics perspective.
Yeah.
Now, they are hampered somewhat by the fact that the GDDR5 that each of them sports is shared between both the CPU and the GPU.
And the CPU is very weak.
Yes. It is decidedly anemic Jaguar and Bobcat cores, which were designed from the beginning to be AMD's low-power cores based on the Excavator architecture, which was the third or fourth iteration of Bulldozer.
Yeah, Bulldozer, Pile Driver. I thought there was one more in between that didn't get released. Yeah, and then Excavator. Excavator was the big daddy one. Okay.
Yeah, because the third one in the middle you were talking about, it did get released, but it was only on their mobile APUs that they called Richland.
Mm-hmm.
And then they released Excavator, and then they iterated on Excavator to make Carrizo and Carrizo L.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I remember feeling very burnt by that when they removed the support for releasing a performance variant of Excavator, because the AM3 Plus socket was supposed to be compatible with up to Excavator, but it never came out. So, yeah. Anyway,
I remember the Athlon X4 845 that was based on that last generation of Excavator. And although it was a low-end part that was basically technically it was a quad core, but let's face it, with the FX CPUs, that meant it was really a dual core quad threaded.
Right.
If we're being perfectly honest with ourselves.
Dual core with kind of hyperthreading.
And so It was still a solid part, though. I played with some systems that had an 845 in it, and paired with a entry-level graphics card, they made solid little budget boxes.
Yeah, I'd say they were good with $200 GPUs probably up until around 2015. That's when they started showing bottlenecking pretty bad with anything greater than a $200 GPU. So, yeah.
And so with this bad news that Navi has been pushed back, the good news is that the initial reports from the engineering teams showed Navi performing greater or above expectations.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a great performing part. The downside is it's not released yet. And that means little competition in the market against Nvidia. So Nvidia can still run rampant with its pricing.
And there was one other little bit tied to this, and that was, we were talking about the semi-custom a few minutes ago, and that was, there was another little leak from Tomb Apisac over on Twitter, and it was of a engineering part number from AMD indicating something called AMD Gonzalo. And what made this interesting was that it included the suffix 10_13E, which he bracketed and put Navi 10 Lite with.
Navi 10 Lite. What does that mean?
Based on, he included his nice little handy chart that is used to indicate to indicate and help interpret what the AMD part numbers mean. So the part number is 2G1600 2CE8JA2.
Okay.
_32.
What does that mean, though?
So here, let me share my screen again. so that everyone can see. Okay, so this is how to decode AMD code names. The 2 indicates the generation prototype. 1 is engineering sample 0, 2 is engineering sample 1, and Z is a quality control sample. The second letter indicates the platform. Now, the G is unusual. D normally means desktop, S normally means server, and M normally means mobile. Also, one of you is really breathing heavy into their mic. The 3 digits here typically indicate base frequency. So that's indicating a 1.6 gigahertz base frequency, relatively.
Which is pretty respectable for a graphics part.
A modeled revision number 0, of course, means this is the first iteration. The 2C is related to TDP. We don't know yet what that means.
Okay.
The E is usually related to what physical package it is.
Well, being a new architecture, there's no disclaimer there, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say, they make note here that M usually means AM4 and V usually means SP3, which SP3 is your Threadripper socket.
Okay.
The 8 indicates the number of cores. And then JA2 _32. Typically, that last one indicates what the cache structure is built like. The fact that it's a J instead of a K or H indicates that this isn't a traditional CPU. Which is why some people are thinking maybe this is, in fact...
I'm thinking console.
Yeah, they're thinking this is probably the next-gen console.
Oh, yeah, Jaguar. JA might...
No,
Well,
it's
not
going to be
Jaguar.
Zen. It's going to be Zen-based.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be Zen-based, but it could be that this is using a new cache structure we have not seen up to this point.
Okay.
Could be.
Well, they so I mean, one of the things they did on the console front was a lot of that HSA stuff. So there's probably going to be a lot of sharing of resources between CPU and GPU resources on the package, which would make sense for a console. So from what I understand, it's going to have Navi. It's supposed to be able to beam around 4K, and it's supposed to be, and being backed by Zen, it's going to have a really decent CPU as well. So pretty cool stuff, man.
Yep. And speaking of 7 nanometer, this next one's from TechSpot, and it's regarding TSMC's transition to 7 nanometer EUV mass production, as well as their future plans about producing CPUs at smaller process nodes.
5 nanometer, I believe, was mentioned.
5 nanometer and 3 nanometer is slated for 2022.
Ooh, okay.
So 5 nanometer apparently is going into what they call risk production, which is a testing phase. But 7 nanometer apparently has reached the point where they're going to be using EUV lithography. Now, EUV stands for extreme ultraviolet lithography. And they have contracted with a partner called ASML to produce the lithography machines necessary. ASML is going to be producing 30 7 nanometer EUV machines in 2019, and TSMC is getting 18 of them.
You know, it kind of feels like TSMC and Global Foundries are kind of running on all cylinders. We're just now getting 7 nanometer out in the market, and you know they're already talking 5 and 3 within the next 3 years, right? So it just feels like it's accelerating, which when you look at the Intel side of things, like they're still struggling with 10 nanometer, which probably is close to or matching 7 nanometer from other fabs, but still. It's good to hear. It's good to get press like this because it does give you some hope, some near-term hope for the near future here. So it's good to hear.
And so the company's on track this year to make the new process up to a quarter of its total sales.
Really? Well, there's a lot of 7 nanometer products slated to come out. ARM, Samsung has its 7 nanometer fab going strong. Gonna have a lot of 7 nanometer electronic memory based parts coming soon. You're gonna see 7 nanometer in the mobile sector really, really quickly. And then obviously AMD is rolling out the CPU line, and then whenever they feel like it, the Radeon Technology division. So,
and you know, you'll notice they are kind of spacing out a little bit for 5 nanometer and 3 nanometer.
mm-hmm.
The thing is, as we get closer to those process nodes, we're going to run into a problem with silicon-based manufacturing, and that is you're going to run into a problem with current leakage, because eventually the transistors are going to be getting so small and so densely packed that basically atoms are going to be able to leak through transistors because there's not enough space separating the transistors from each other.
Well, I think what you're going to see is CPU engineering, or how should I say it? I think you'll see transistor engineering getting more creative, and I think that we're starting to see some bits of that, right? So you've got AMD with their chiplet design. Intel is starting to talk some creative approaches with stacking. Remember that from yeah. So I think we're going to start seeing mixtures of parts of different manufacturing nodes. Like with AMD coming back to the chiplet design with the 14 nanometer IO versus the 7 nanometer chiplets. And I think we're going to start seeing more modular designs. We're going to start seeing some more, like I said, creative approaches. So it's going to be interesting to see how they get around the silicone. I guess you could call it limitation or barrier. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the talk roughly a decade ago was, oh, we're going to be moving to different materials, but that never really materialized, or at least it hasn't yet.
Yeah, and there were all kinds of fun conspiracies that came out of that. Like they were researching nerve cells, and I'm not sure what other materials they were looking at that point. But
the big ones that you heard the most about were gallium arsenide and graphene.
I do remember graphene. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And it would not surprise me to see graphene eventually make its way over into process technology for processors, simply because graphene is relatively easy to make, and designing transistors around it would be relatively simple. The problem as I understood it with graphene, was efficiency.
Well, maybe they'll have multiple materials that they use for different types of devices on the fabrication process. So like you might have cache out of one material and maybe integer or floating point units made out of a different material or process node, or I don't know, man. It's going to be interesting, but I think with the modularity of freedom, they're going to start breaking out bits and pieces of the traditional CPU, and we're going to see some interesting things.
I mean, we've already started to see the rise of the idea of rather than having a traditional CPU, basically having what is a system on a chip.
Well, yeah, we've had those aspects for a while now, right? We've had the memory controller on die. We've had PCI Express bits and pieces on die. We've had graphics on die for a long time now. It just makes sense. It's more efficient.
And we saw experimentation back in the Broadwell generation with the C-series CPUs of even having a high-speed level 4 cache that was basically faster than DRAM, but not as fast as I believe it was the 5775C had the onboard 128 megabyte eDRAM cache.
That's right. They had a Broadwell. That's right. I remember that.
And the thing was, because of that 128 megabyte eDRAM cache, the 5775C actually had comparable GPU performance to the AMD APUs at the same time period.
Mm-hmm. That's because of that fast memory allocation.
Even though the iGPU was weaker in the 5775C than it was in the comparable A10 7850K APU.
Well, that's because of the memory bank being low latency and super fast. Yeah.
So I think we could see a return of, they call that Crystal Well. I think we could see a return of those Crystal Well eDRAM caches potentially. The reason they didn't go forward with them is because they were relatively expensive at the time.
And if I remember right, there was a big backlash in the community about potentially having soldered CPU cores onto the board.
Yeah, the there was talk at that time of improving latency through BGA instead of ball grid array soldered on CPUs versus
consumers were like, no, you're not. We're not going to buy it. So,
admittedly, I actually own a computer that is ball grid array at the moment.
really?
But it's a older an older mini ITX motherboard that has a soldered on AMD laptop APU on board, but it can accept standard desktop DRAM, and it has a PCI 2.0 by 16 slot. So if I wanted to put a graphics card in there, I could.
That's interesting. Well, your mobile applications have been doing that for a while, so that it makes sense.
If you wanted to look it up, it's a BioStar A8 5545M mini ITX motherboard, and obviously the onboard soldered BGA chip is an AMD A8 5545 APU, which was a solid budget laptop processor at the time, and is still pretty solid for most applications. At least everything I use it for, which is as a home theater PC.
Interesting.
And so, or excuse me, it's the AA5545 is the processor. The actual motherboard, I think, was the BioStar A868N or A68N-5545. There was also a 5745 that was the higher end and faster clocked CPU that had a slightly more powerful internal GPU.
You know, coming back to the system on a chip thing, when's the last time you ever heard of an actual bona fide North Bridge? It's been a while.
I was going to say, those have pretty much been integrated since the Sandy Bridge days, at the very least.
Yeah. And the FX days. Or Athlon 64 even. Wow. Been a while.
So let's see. Oh, yes. So for our first big show topic, there's been a lot of leaks about the upcoming GTX 1660 and 1660 Ti. There was a long while there where this CPU or this GPU was rumored, and Nvidia didn't say a whole lot about it. And then they had a press day a couple of weeks back where at the very end, Jensen pulled a classic "oh, and one more thing" moment and included some slides about other GTX Turing cards.
By the way.
And so we're starting to see some alleged leaks. Most of these come from VideoCardZ or VideoCards.com. But these, I have various articles from a number of different sources. This first one from Tom's Hardware. I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen again because these are mostly photo leaks. So,
yay, screen sharing time. Yay.
So, this first one is the MSI GTX 1660 Ti Ventus XS, which allegedly leaked, and this is from Tom's Hardware, but their source is VideoCardZ, or VideoCards. So this is apparently the bare PCB of the 1660 Ti. So interesting things to note. There are room for up to 8 GDDR5 modules. Only 6 of them are filled.
Okay.
This is what it looks like with the cooler on.
Not a bad looking card.
And partly edited out here, this is the Nvidia TU116-400-A1 GPU at the heart of the 1660 Ti.
Okay.
And so Video Card Z apparently got some additional information about the 1660 Ti in that it is reportedly set to debut on February 22nd, with a non-Ti variant coming, quote, probably next month, end quote. Apparently, these are supposed to be coming with 1,536 CUDA cores and 6 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. And of course, the reason they're being marketed as GTX cards is because they lack ray tracing support.
Yeah.
So, a couple of other leaks we had here. This is coming directly from Video Cards. This is the Evga Geforce Gtx 1660 Ti XC model. Something to note, as you'll see on several of these, all of these seem to have relatively short PCBs and like they've been optimized almost to be used as mini ITX cards.
Yeah.
So this is the Evga 1660 Ti XC model. And apparently there's also going to be a XC Black.
Well, I'm guessing TDP is going to be around 120 or 150.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
And finally, we have this one from Palette, the GTX 1660 Ti Storm X. Now, Palette's not one you hear as much here in the States, but I actually have had a couple of Palette cards.
They're good.
And they did me well. I originally had a Palette GTX 460 Sonic Edition, which was their mid-tier GTX 460 at the time. A solid card. I eventually traded up for a GTX 560 Ti 448 core. But regardless, I had very good experience with my Palette card. So this is the Gaming Storm X and the Storm X OC. I really don't see a visual difference here other than the packaging. So I'm guessing this is just the overclocked model.
Yeah. It'll be a decent, I'm just based on the potential specs, it'll be a decent 1080p gamer.
They do mention here that the Storm OC, the Storm X OC variant will clock to 1815 megahertz, whereas the non-OC variant will be the default 1770 megahertz.
Well, depending on how power restricted they are, I mean, it wouldn't be out of the realm possibility to get up to around 2 gigahertz, honestly. So,
and of course, we know that Nvidia can never release a mid-tier graphics card without including a slightly memory and CUDA core limped version.
Yeah, don't get me started on Max Q, man.
So apparently, they're also preparing 3 gigabyte models of this same card. Because reasons.
I mean, other than price, I don't really know if it's really neat.
Well,
usable, useful, because you can't run VR on 3 gigs.
With the amount of horsepower that card has, it's ridiculous for it to have a 3 gigabyte variant.
Yeah.
So
in 2019 at 1080p, you can get by with 3 gigabytes, but it's uncalled for. Especially because you know those cards are going to be north of 225.
Yeah. Well, the only reason why the 3 gig 1060s were used, weren't they used like in internet cafes or something? Or gaming, not internet cafes, but gaming places.
Sub $200.
Yeah, there was a China-specific variant that was produced specifically for that purpose, which was the GTX 1065 gigabyte.
Yeah, it's probably for the StarCraft StarCraft internet cafes.
Pretty much. And we've talked before, calling the 3 gigabyte GTX 1060 a 1060 was a travesty of marketing. But
yeah, because the 1050 Ti had at least 1 gig more than the 1060. So stupid.
Yeah, and when it was sold and when it came out in 2016, 4 gigs was a decent amount of VRAM, especially at that point.
4 gig 1050 Ti was the minimum for Oculus Rift.
Well, I think the idea from Nvidia at the time was they needed something to fit between the GTX 1050 Ti at $150 at the time and the GTX 1060 at $250 to $300.
Because they're trying to compete with AMD's lower tier cards.
Compete with the RX 570 and 580, which were selling for the RX 570 at the time was selling for roughly $199.
Well, even that card had 4 gig and a 4 gig and an 8 gig variant. Yep. So having a 3 gig competitor is stupid.
It was, but thanks to the cryptocurrency boom and the fact that the 3 gig model was not good for crypto mining, it sold like hotcakes.
Yeah.
Just got to have external memory that you can add in to a card.
Which is why the 3 gigabyte model of the proposed 1660 Ti makes absolutely no sense to me, because in 2019, a 3 gigabyte frame buffer just barely cuts it for 1080p, let alone 3 years from now.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to make a decent amount of sacrifices now just to get 3 gigs working. Imagine 3 years from now.
So, Nvidia is going to keep their steady decline in sales and keep shooting themselves in the foot.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm not sure what Nvidia is thinking with a 3 gig GTX 1660, but unless AMD can bring something new to the market to fight them in that budget space, I'm not sure they're going to have a whole lot of competition, because let's face it, the RX 580 is basically a almost 4-year-old design at this point.
Yeah, and if you look at the RX 590, is it? I get them mixed up because
590 is the newest mid tier.
Yeah, so if you look at the RX 590, it's pretty well tapped out, man. I mean, yeah, you can maybe overclock it slightly, but you don't get any better performance, really.
Yeah.
Not like you do overclocking a 580 or 570, where you get decent returns still.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The RX 590, the best I've seen people be able to do with it is undervolt it so that it uses less power to hit the same clocks that it gets out of the box.
Right.
With the 590, unfortunately, most of the time you're going to be looking to improve efficiency rather than actually try to crank it to the max.
And really, honestly, like the only reason for that is just to help out the boost, but mainly just to help your fan speeds. You know, because a lot of the fans on those cards, when they get around 2,500 RPM, they're unbearably loud, man.
Yeah, as we saw from the 2,000 RPM issue with the Radeon 7.
Well, those things will go right up to 2,900 RPM.
Right.
Now, thankfully, you've got the auto undervolt button. You know,
what, man?
Yeah, and that takes your RPMs down to about 2,000 or 1,800 in a lot of cases, and you see no performance deficiency at all. Like the temps might go up a few degrees Celsius, but it lets you operate at an 1,800 RPM fan speed, and at that point the card is nearly silent. So that's bearable time. 2900 RPM is not bearable.
No, not for long periods of time. Yeah, if anyone remembers the R9 290 and 290X and what those blower coolers were like, running at about 2800 RPM.
I can imagine.
Yeah, there was a reason that one was called the leaf blower.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of performance, let's transition to the next topic. There's been some interesting AMD Ryzen CPU news. Now, it's interesting because AMD hasn't announced any new Ryzen CPUs, and yet here they are. And so this first one comes from Tom's Hardware, and it's based on an AMD report they released. So obviously take this with a little bit of grain of salt, but apparently they've been working with Blizzard to improve AMD Ryzen performance in World of Warcraft.
Which at 1080p, I mean, it's not an incredibly demanding game anyway. It's just interesting.
Well,
that
World of Warcraft, since it's based on an engine that's basically been upgraded since 2004, is very single core, or at least used to be very single core dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously the limitation often was clock speed or frequency when it came to running the game at higher frame rates. And so even though it's probably one of the most successful MMOs of all time, it's basically having anything beyond 2 to 4 cores was a waste because it did not utilize CPUs effectively. However, with the release of Battle for Azeroth, or at least patch 8.1 Tides of Vengeance, AMD reports that you could see anywhere up to a 35% improvement in frame rates at 1080p at the level 10 image quality settings, which is basically the World of Warcraft version of Ultra. But it's when you use DirectX 12.
Nice. I wish more game publishers followed suit. That'd be nice.
And so, according to AMD, before the patch, they recorded an average frame rate of 43.2 FPS with a Ryzen 5 2500X and 42.7 FPS with the Ryzen 7 2700X. Because obviously the 2700X runs at a lower base clock speed than the 2500X.
Yeah.
After the patch, those figures increased to 58.1% or 58.1 FPS with the 2500X and 58.2 FPS with the 2700X.
Interesting.
And their test bench had 16 gigs of DDR4 at 3200 megahertz, a GTX 1080, and a Samsung 850 EVO SSD running off Windows 10, which is pretty solid mid to upper tier gaming setup.
Mm.
And so it's interesting to me that a game as old as World of Warcraft, there's still room for it to improve, and specifically in this case with Ryzen processors.
Yeah.
Well, it goes to show you how AMD's kind of clawed themselves back into getting market gains. So it's good to see.
So I mentioned that AMD reported that this part of these performance increases with the 2500X. Now, if that part doesn't sound familiar to you, it's because the 2500X and the 2300X, or the Ryzen 5 2500X and the Ryzen 3 2300X, are parts that AMD released to OEMs only. But Ian Koutras, over at Anantech was able to get his hands on both of them, and he ran them through his traditional benchmark suite. Now, if you're not familiar, the 2300X is a 4-core, 4-thread Zen Plus based CPU running at a base clock of 3500 megahertz and a boost clock of 4.0 gigahertz. Meanwhile, the 2500X is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU, also based on Zen Plus architecture, with a base clock of 3.6 gigahertz and a boost clock of 4.0 gigahertz. Both feature an 8 megabyte L3 cache and a TDP of roughly 65 watts.
Yep, they're pretty efficient.
So basically, these are, for lack of a better term, the modern versions of the 1500X and the 1300X from first-gen Ryzen.
Yeah.
Just this time, we're not seeing them in the sales channel.
I'm kind of curious as to why we're not seeing them in the sales channel.
Apparently, AMD's thinking is that for users in those price brackets, they would be better served by the 2200G or the 2400G.
Yeah.
Because those do include internal graphics that you can use until you can upgrade to a discrete graphics card. Or if you're wanting to use a discrete graphics card out of the gate, then, well, from a price perspective, the Ryzen 5 2600X actually makes more sense. 600 non-X, excuse me.
Which you can get between 150 to 170 typically, so.
Right, and with the 2400G being roughly $170 itself, if you're doing a full build with a discrete graphics card, the 2600 makes more sense.
Right.
And so both of these are intended for the mid-range, which makes sense because they were in the first gen too. And the kind of weird thing, though, is that they don't have a lot of competition from Intel in their price brackets. I mean, you have the i3-8100 at around $120. And then you have the i3-8350K at right around $190. But
which at that price point really doesn't make sense because you can get a 2600, heck, even a 2600X. You know, the X is a monster CPU, especially at $200.
Yeah.
And the 2600 is just an amazing value, you know, if you get it at 150 or 170. And go ahead.
The thing is, with the 2500X, there's really no direct competitor from Intel because the next closest thing would be something like the Core i5-9600K, which is a 6-core, 6-thread part. But that's $260.
And when you look at power consumption, they're pretty efficient.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just don't understand. It would be intriguing to build a system around a 2500X, I think.
And so I think part of the reason, and if you flip over to the conclusion that Ian makes here, he talks about why the 2300X and the 2500X likely are OEM only. And that is that they fit in very tiny niches in AMD's product stack. The 2500X is a quad core with multi-threading, or simultaneous multi-threading. And it's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. The 2400G is often on sale at $145 with very similar specs, slightly lower frequency, lower power consumption, and integrated graphics.
Right.
And
honestly, the 2400G is a pretty decent CPU.
Meanwhile, at roughly between $160 and $190, depending on if you catch it on sale or not, you have the Ryzen 5 2600 with 2 extra cores and 4 extra threads and similar clock speeds.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you were to put the 2500X out there, it basically loses on price to the 2400G, and it loses on value to the 2600. And the 2300X has a similar problem. It's basically a faster 2200G without the graphics.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's 4 threads. So,
which means that if you charge more than the 2200G at $100, 95 to $100, where's that going to slot in between the 2200G and the 2400G?
Yeah, people would probably rather have the onboard graphics because they'll say, well, in case my graphics card goes out, I can use the onboard for a while and save up and get something else, or not even bother with it. So, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know. It'd just still be nice to have them. I know there's probably not much of a case you can make, but it'd still be nice to see them out there.
And so, basically, his conclusion is this. The 2300X would be a solid budget option for people who don't want to use integrated graphics, especially if AMD marketed it at around $110 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the 2500X has a much harder sell, being that it's between 2 very excellent parts in the 2400G and the 2600.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this line, I think, is the key line here. And that is, the only way the 2500X makes sense is if either the 2400G or the 2600 isn't available in a particular market.
You know what I'm waiting for? I'm waiting for a monster AMD overclocker. That's the only thing I don't like about Ryzen.
Well, basically, AMD did the same thing they have been doing for a while now, which is they crank the clocks on what they have to try and maintain parity. Because even though Ryzen has IPC parity, at least first-gen Ryzen has IPC parity with Haswell and Skylake, it doesn't have that same frequency advantage that Intel has. And so we see it over and over again with AMD CPUs and their GPUs. They tend to crank the voltage, crank the clocks to try and get more out of the box. And unfortunately, that doesn't leave you with a whole lot of headroom with these chips.
That's true.
But if you're willing to play around with the settings a bit, undervolt them a bit, play with the clocks a little, you can get similar performance while typically being a bit more power efficient. And if you have pretty good silicon, you can actually overclock them just a little bit more.
Yeah, that's why a lot of people run Ryzen or Zen Plus with a negative offset if they can. Yeah, it does give you noticeable thermal benefits, actually. So
I was going to say, you run your 2700X with a negative offset, don't you?
Yeah, for a long time I was running with Precision Boost Overdrive, and I was seeing clock speeds. It would generally hover around 4.25 to 4.35 gigahertz, but it was pumping so much voltage through, man. It was pumping like 1.5, 1.55 in a lot of cases. So I had to run a negative offset to counter that, and still I was seeing really high thermals. Eventually, I just turned the precision boost overdrive off, and I'm still running a negative 100 millivolt offset, and typically I'm right around 1.25 volts, and that's made a huge difference in thermals. And honestly, I don't notice any performance difference at all, and I'm sitting around usually anywhere from 4.05 gigahertz to 4.1 gigahertz all day long. So it's a huge thermal benefit going from 1.45 to 1.5 volts to 1.25 volts. It's a huge thermal benefit. I just don't see the reason to go a few hundred megahertz for 250 millivolts. I mean, it makes a huge difference thermally, so I just clock it down. Even with water cooling, it makes a big difference. So yeah, we're talking essentially, if we want to put it into a temperature perspective, I idle at around 25 degrees centigrade, and at load I'm at 40 degrees centigrade. When I'm gaming and my Vega dumps 300 watts of thermal energy into the loop, my CPU at load goes up to about 50 degrees centigrade. Now, before, when I had precision boost going and I was at like 1.45 volts, it would easily jump up to about 70 degrees centigrade. 60 when I had my Vega going. So yeah, it's a huge difference thermally. Now I don't know if that's because of my CPU block or not, but honestly, I'm perfectly fine with running it at its current setting. It's still overclocked. I mean, it still boosts itself just fine over the 3.7 gigahertz base. So I'm perfectly happy with the 4 gigahertz, 8-core chip. So
sounds like a winner to me.
Yes, sir.
Well, if you've been enjoying Ryzen, you want to take that to the mobile space, there have been some mobile Ryzen options in the Ryzen 5 2500U and the Ryzen 7 2700U. Well, today, as we're recording this, which is February 14th, Valentine's Day of 2019, Asus has released the first notebooks with Ryzen 3000 mobile parts. The Asus Tough Gaming FX 705 and the Tough Gaming FX 505. Both of them with the Ryzen 5 3550H.
Notice the FX.
Yeah.
I saw that. I was like, all right.
Asus being cheeky.
Yep. And kind of brave considering the bad press they've gotten for the Tough line recently.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Ryzen 5 3350H is a quad-core, 8-thread CPU clocked with 2.1 gigahertz base clock and a 3.7 gigahertz boost clock. It features 4 megabytes of L3 cache, 2 megabytes of L2 cache, and it features the Vega 8 integrated GPU with 512 stream processors, clocked at 1200 megahertz. And so, there is supposedly higher end models coming later, but for now, the 3550H is the highest end model currently available. Now, if we pop over here to WCCF Tech, and take a look at this chart that they have available, you'll notice that there is a couple of higher-end parts. The Ryzen 7 3750H, which is also 4-core 8-thread, and it is running at 2.3 gigahertz with a 4.0 gigahertz boost, but it features a GPU we haven't seen before in Vega 10, having 640 stream processors.
Which I believe they say that that's coming out later.
Correct.
So I would like to see a review on that. And I believe they also say that one or two of these FXs are coming with a dedicated graphics card.
Yes, the Tough Gaming FX 705 is a 17.3-inch model that has an IPS display with FreeSync support. In addition to the Vega 10 graphics, it also includes an RX 560X, which basically is the mobile variant of the RX 560. Features 4 gigs of GDDR5 and 1024 stream processors. So,
well, yeah, the GPU itself is probably just a marginal upgrade, but the dedicated video RAM would make a big difference, probably.
And so it'll be coming with either a 1 terabyte SSHD, or a high-end PCIe Gen 3 SSD, likely of the M.2 variety. The FX 505, though, is the one that's more interesting to me, because that is the 15-inch model. It will also feature a 60 hertz non-FreeSync display or a 120 hertz FreeSync enabled display. And also features the same...
Yeah, the same specs.
Mm-hmm.
The same dedicated GPU. I kind of agree with you there. Like, this wouldn't be a bad... Wow, look at the price point.
Yeah, 699 euros, which...
Okay.
In US dollars, that's roughly 800 bucks.
Okay. That's a little pricey for me. I mean, I probably wouldn't spend that much, but...
Although, I will say, there's a tendency when it comes to pricing like this, that they do a direct correlation from dollars to euros, where if it's 699 euros, it'll wind up being $699 in the States. Even though, in reality, the euro is about 20% more than the dollar.
Yeah. Which, at that price point, yeah, I could see getting it. You know, considering what you get.
Yeah, for what is essentially an entry-level gaming notebook with solid integrated graphics when you want to sip on the power and decent mid-tier graphics when you don't. Particularly if you're playing at 1080p and you're playing the type of games you'd normally play on a laptop, which are typically going to be more your e-sporty type titles, then yeah, it would be more than sound for that.
Plus, you know, you get a lot of flexibility in the system, right? You get 8 threads, and we know Ryzen's multi-threaded performance, so this is kind of a decent lower to mid-range, like jack of all trades kind of a computer. This would not be bad.
Yeah, this is something I would look at to replace. My laptop I'm currently using is about 5 years old. It was a solid entry-level workstation machine for its time. It had a Core i7-4702MQ, 4-core 8-thread. It originally had 8 gigabytes of DDR3 that I've upgraded to 16 since then. It originally came with a 1 terabyte hard drive. I took that 1 terabyte hard drive and added a 240 gigabyte SSD as the boot drive and kept the 1 terabyte as a storage drive.
Nice.
And it came with a GT750M graphics card, which had 4 gigabytes of VRAM included with it. Overkill for that particular GPU, by the way. But since I was mostly using it for workstation and schoolwork type stuff, it was fine for when I wanted to do schoolwork and then do a little light gaming on the side.
Yeah.
That machine, it still handles most titles pretty well at 1080p, particularly lighter titles. Back when I was using that machine heavily, I used to play CSGO and Dirty Bomb a lot.
Dirty Bomb.
Hey, Dirty Bomb was a fun game. It just never really quite took off.
Okay.
It was basically Overwatch meets CSGO. And
Yeah.
And it was free to play. So
Nice.
I played it a little bit. It was actually pretty fun.
it just never quite took off.
Yeah, it did.
I'm just laughing at the name.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the lore of the game, as it were, is that someone set off a dirty nuclear device in London.
The Laura. Laura.
All right. Well, gentlemen, that is all the news for the evening, but we are not done. Every week we try to feature what we consider to be some of the best hardware deals currently available. And this week is no exception.
Mm-hmm.
So you all provided some of these that were some solid choices. And I went with 4 of them because the 4 of them together would constitute a solid core to any system.
Mm-hmm.
Really, if you went with these 4, the only things you'd need to finish out the system would be some RAM and a graphics card.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start with this first deal is from Amazon. And let me share my screen again so that our lovely audience can see. So here we have from Amazon the Ryzen 5 2600, which we talked about just a few minutes ago. Comes with the Wraith Stealth Cooler. It is on sale on Amazon for $149.99. That's $150 for a 6-core, 12-thread CPU featuring a boost clock of 3.9 gigahertz, which is easily overclocked to 4.0 or higher.
This thing's a steal, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
By the way, there is a deal right now where if you did want to get some RAM to go with this, there is this deal where you can get the Ryzen 5 2600 with a 16 gig kit of DDR4 3000 and its Corsair LPX for $270.
That's a good kit. I have that, and I have both of those in my current sleeper build.
So there you go. That if you took that deal, it would actually cover the whole RAM angle as well.
Yep.
But we're mostly focused on the CPU itself, which at $150, this is the mid-range CPU to get. Bar none, this is the value king.
Oh yeah, easily. That's crazy. $150.
Now, if you find that the Wraith Stealth Cooler doesn't quite fulfill your needs, Newegg's eBay store is having a sale on Nzxt Kraken X52 240mm all-in-one RGB CPU coolers. So this is a 240 millimeter water cooler that features NZXT's Infinity Mirror. As you can see in the photo here, the cooler looks something like this. You can see it is a 240 millimeter radiator. It uses what is essentially an Asetek block and pump combo. And it does integrate with NZXT's CAM software.
Which the CAM software is very nice. It allows you to do a lot of things, including GPU and CPU overclocking, although I wouldn't recommend it for that. But it allows you to adjust the pump speed and the fan curves to anything that you like. And it also gives you a lot of control over some RGB settings for that infinity mirror. It's a pretty good performing water cooler, honestly. Like it'll keep an overclocked 2700X in check pretty easily.
And there's everything you get in the kit. Now, the X52 is not the newest cooler from NZXT. That would be its successor, the X62. But the X52 is still a solid higher end all-in-one cooler.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, the fans spin up to about 22 or 2400 RPM, I think.
And at $100, considering that this is normally a $150 part, well worth the price.
Yeah. I mean, technically, yeah. I mean, it is 30% off, but you're going to have 240 mil AIOs that perform very similarly that you can get cheaper. But the overall package, I mean, it's a very solid cooler. It's very good quality. So,
yeah, I know the one in particular you're probably thinking of is Cooler Master's ML240 range. And those can typically be had in about the $80 to $90 range. I don't think the ML240s use as thick a radiator as the X52, though.
I don't know. I mean, anything that has the Asetek design is right around 27 to 30 millimeters thick. The fractal design Celsius S24 is also another consideration, and that's also right around $80 to $90, I want to say. Corsair usually has one for right around 100.
Yeah, usually it's something like the H105.
And it's going to perform similarly. Arctic Freezer, I think, has one. Enermax. There's Deep Cool's got another one. Like, there's a bunch of them at the 240 mil range. I want to say the Kraken is one of the better performers, but it's not a huge difference.
Right. Part of what you're paying for here is the NZXT name.
Mm-hmm.
And you are paying a bit for the RGB bling.
Yeah, and I will say that the Infinity Mirror is actually very pretty. It is very pretty.
So, of course, if you're going to get the Ryzen 5 2600 and you are going to slap the X52 on top of it to cool it, you're going to need a motherboard to put it in. And kudos to Hunter for finding this one.
Yep.
The Asrock Be Gaming K4. If I remember correctly, Jason, this was actually one of the motherboards you praised when we looked at the B450 motherboards.
Yep. It's got a clunky BIOS, but it's got solid build quality. I want to say it's right around a 4-phase VRM. It's got decent memory performance, and I don't think the I/O is anything too great, but it's not horrible. It's a solid board, honestly. Can't go wrong with it.
And they claim a 9-power phase design, but if it's a 4-phase design doubled, or if it's a 4+1 design doubled, then yeah, that would make sense.
It's a 4-phase. That 9-phase stuff is a bunch of bull honky.
Right. That's why I'm saying it's probably a 4-phase doubled.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it for an 8-core X variant. You know, you're probably going to be okay with a non-X as long as you're not overclocking it too heavily. Definitely 6-core and down, no problem.
Yeah. To pair with the Ryzen 5 2600, this is a solid option.
Mm-hmm.
It will support up to 64 gigs of RAM. It does support 2 full PCIe 3.0 times 16 lanes. Or, excuse me, it has a full PCIe by 16 lane, and you can run 2 at times 8, which is pretty standard.
Yep. As far as B450 boards go, it's about mid-range. You know, it's a pretty solid board.
And if we take a look at some of these other photos, you can take a look. This is part of their Fatality series. This is what the back I/O looks like. Notice that you get 2 USB 2.0s and a dual-purpose PS2 port. You get VGA out. You get HDMI and DisplayPort out if you're using this with one of the APUs. You get a USB Type-C and what is, I would assume, is a USB 3.1 port.
Mm-hmm.
2 USB 3.0s, 2 USB 3.0s with the RJ45 jack, and some basic 2.1 audio.
Yep.
And so, again, solid budget board, $95. Throw the 2600 on here. Throw that 16 gigs of Corsair RAM in here. Attach the X62 if you want to try your luck at overclocking the 2600. Spoilers, you probably won't need to.
But be aware. Look at the memory types, the memory speeds. I have a 3000 megahertz kit, and it downclocked to 2933. So it does depend on the motherboard. The RAM speed does depend on the motherboard, and I guess if you want to get it at the desired speed or the speed you paid for, you have to overclock it.
Is that after you loaded the XMP profile?
I chose that. It actually downclocked it to 2666, and I had the XMP profile was 2933.
Okay.
I don't have that same motherboard, but a similar situation of paying for a 3000 megahertz kit and not getting that speed when I put it when I went into BIOS.
Yeah, sometimes you get lucky and you can clock it up to 3200 or 3400.
Yeah. I was trying to get it to that for Infinity Fabric.
Ah.
I don't want to push overclocks too much in the case that I have right now that's got limited airflow.
Right, because you're running the sleeper, correct?
Yep. And I've got another plan for another sleeper build coming up. But in any other case, modern case that has good airflow and good ventilation, that would be fine. And
well, you're not gonna notice much of a difference between 3000 and 2933 anyway.
Yeah.
All right, and for our last hardware deal for this show, this one is the HP EX920. This is an M.2 SSD. It is 512 gigabytes. It is an NVMe SSD. It does use TLC NAND, so it's not going to be the fastest SSD out there. But given that it is NVMe 1.3 compatible, it does feature sequential read and write speeds of up to 3200 megabits per second for reads, and 1800 megabits per second for writes.
which makes it a great scratch disk.
Yeah.
And so if we go down and we take a look at the specs, we see here, of course, they use the weasel words up to 3,200 megabits per second. They quote here 1,600 megabits per second write, and random read of 340,000 IOPS, or integer operations per second, or IO operations per second, and 260,000 IOPS for 4K random write, and a mean time between failure of 2 million hours.
Well, the important specs are TLC and the interface. So,
yeah, the only thing I would like to know that they don't mention here is what the controller is.
yeah.
It's probably one of the commonly used ones, either from Phison or Silicon Motion, because that's typically what you find in the budget drives like this. But I'd be curious to know.
Well, you can usually a vendor like HP is going to stick with one. They're going to stick with a some stability there in the controller per model. So if you do a little research, you should be able to figure that out.
Yeah, that's something I meant to look up beforehand and just ran out of time to do so. But if I had to guess, you're probably looking at either a Phison or a Silicon Motion controller, which both are solid. Phison is usually slightly more performant, whereas Silicon Motion generally has higher reliability. It's 6 of one, a half dozen of the other.
Well, given how crazy reliable SSDs are, it's just...
But the important bit is the part that I haven't mentioned yet, the fact that you can get this 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD in an M.2 form factor for $79.
That's crazy.
For reference, a similar size drive from Samsung costs almost twice that.
Not surprising. That's a no-brainer, actually, when you take that into consideration, and you're not going to see twice the performance, right?
Exactly. No.
You're probably getting 90 to 95% of the performance. I'd say probably closer to 95%.
And you can see I have the Hoverhound extension installed. And what Hoverhound does is it lets you, when you're on Newegg, compare prices to other sites available. And you can see this same drive over on Amazon right now is $115.
Oh my gosh.
So
that's crazy.
So hop on this deal while you can, because this is a solid one.
Oh, yeah.
And with that, I'm afraid we have exhausted all the topics on the agenda for this week, gentlemen. So, anything else you would like to add?
No. My brain is tapped out for the night.
Yeah, not at this point.
Verge is bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you take away nothing from this evening, ladies and gentlemen watching, do not copyright strike people just because you don't like what they have to say.
Yeah.
That is bad.
We got free speech on the internet for a reason.
Yes.
And so, it's been our pleasure to present this podcast. If you've enjoyed the content here, of course, you can see more of our past TechForge videos in the playlist that will be found in the links in the description. You can find links to all of our articles there as well. If you've enjoyed everything you've seen here, of course, we do this podcast once a week, barring any unforeseen circumstances. And you can also find all kinds of other great content here on the CrossForge Gaming YouTube channel. If you want to join our community, you can find us on Facebook. We'll have links to that below as well as to our Discord server and to all the other social media places you can find us online. In the meantime, I've been Dynamo Ned. This has been TechForge. And remember, when life has you down, Jesus loves you, so forge on.